Hello and welcome back. We are going to cover the epilogue in this series. We're going to be talking about death and dying. A lot of my colleagues who teach this class conveniently make sure that they don't have enough time to cover this final chapter. And in fact, I think the fact that it's the epilogue and not an actual chapter is a nod from the publisher that not everybody wants to talk about this. Death is part of life, and I think it's important to talk about it. All of us will lose people and will die at some point, and so I think it's worth talking about. Thanatology is the study of death and dying. One of the things that thanatologists really, I guess, surprise a lot of us who aren't thanatologists by saying is that they feel like death actually gives us hope. So they study the social and emotional aspects of death and find that there is hope in death, that we can learn to accept the fact that we're going to die, that our loved ones are going to die, and that really the fact that we know that we're going to die is a reaffirmation of the importance of life. I watched a podcast where they were debating whether if we were to be able to live forever or, for a really, really long time, like if the, I can't remember what it's called, where our brains will be able to live on even after our bodies die, stuff like that. If that were to come to fruition, would it impact the meaningfulness of life? And it's a really interesting question that, knowing that you're only here for a short amount of time, does that really make life more meaningful than if you thought you had endless amounts of time? In a related type of idea, I just read another study that said that when you have unlimited amounts of free time, that free time actually starts to become a burden. Whereas if you have limited amounts of free time, you value them and you try and really take advantage of them to pursue something that you really like or something like that. And so I feel like that kind of dovetails together with this question about whether knowing that at the end everybody dies, does that make us a little bit more aware of the precious thing that is our lives? Well, let's first talk about how coping with death changes across the lifespan. So we're going to start with childhood. Babies, toddlers, preschoolers don't really have a concept of loss or things, and then they don't have great memories, so that, even if they at the moment are very invested in the loss, they probably won't remember it over time. So we're going to be talking a little older children when we talk about this. If a parent were to die, children don't really get over that. It's something that they're reminded of all the time when, as they're growing and developing, that other people have a parent that they don't have. And it reminds them that, they have a loss. Even if they don't remember how their parent died or when their parent died, they have that overall sense of loss. So they don't get over it as in like it didn't really harm them or they've forgotten about it. But children who have lost their parents don't usually dwell on it to the degree that we kind of as adults would expect them to. When you hear about somebody like, Rosie O'Donnell talks about how her mother died of breast cancer when Rosie was 12 or something like that. She's not perpetually trying to process the loss of her mom. She hasn't gotten over it. I mean, she obviously has a void that can't be filled by anyone else. And so she's aware of it, but it's not like it defines her. And that's, I think, really typical of people who have lost a parent in childhood. One of the things we as adults who might be helping a child through the loss of a parent or a hamster, to a child, it's kind of all equal to them, and barely reality for them. So one of the things we need to do when a death of anything or anyone occurs with children is to not use a lot of euphemisms. Like, it's really tempting to say, oh, they've gone up to heaven, and sort of look at the sky. And children oftentimes will think that that's literal, that their loved one or their pet or whatever is now floating over them, and might even internalize it as kind of creepy that they're being watched and they can't see who's watching them. I mean, they may take these explanations literally. When I was a little kid, when a dog needed to be put down, they referred to it, at least my family referred to it, as putting them to sleep. And that's kind of a risky phrase. I don't recall it harming my psyche or anything, because I think I was a little older when my dog was put down. But littler kids hearing that the dog was put to sleep or that, grandma has gone for a long sleep or something, it can actually generate fear of going to sleep, that they may never wake up. And so you got to be really careful about the kind of nice phrasing that you try to use with children. It's probably better to actually just tell them what really happened, that, grandpa had an illness that he tried to fight, but it ultimately got him. And now we don't get to have grandpa anymore. Something like that. It's a really hard conversation. Nobody wants to talk about it, but children need decent explanations so that they're not expecting grandpa to come visit next weekend, stuff like that. Children who are facing death, which is like the saddest thing ever to think about, a child who's facing death. In younger children, one of their biggest things, as if they know that their loved one is ill and is potentially going to die, their biggest concern is that they're going to be left alone, that no one's going to take care of them. And so, making sure that children are aware that there's a whole network of people who are going to take care of them and they're never going to be alone and that they're not being abandoned. It's a lot more important that the caregivers just give a lot of frequent contact, a lot of caring, hugs and reassurances, and not a lot of let's try and explain the details of exactly what's happening, because the logic is going to be lost on a younger child. What they're concerned about is their own health and safety. With older children, a lot of times they want to know the specific facts, like what exactly happened to the dog, what exactly happened to grandpa, when a dog, let's say, gets hit by a car, and you really don't want to tell the children the details, right? Because you're like, well, this is too much for them and it might be scary. It can actually be really healthy for them to understand exactly what happened to the dog. Like the dog ran out into the street and didn't see that a car was coming, and the car hit him, and just there, it was too much and the dog couldn't survive, right? Like just be really child level words, and they don't need to know about the lacerated spleen or like these kinds of details, but they need to know that, that this was an accident, that, accidents can kill dogs or children or other things. And it also can be the source of like a little bit of guidance for the child also, right? Like that's why we don't run into the street. And you don't want to scare them. So now they're like terrified of the blacktop. Oh, I can't walk on the blacktop. It's really a tightrope that you walk with children, and it's not a one-time conversation either. Even older children who are seeking specific facts oftentimes will keep asking, even though you already explained it to them. They may ask again because they really are trying to process the information. They're really trying to figure out what happened. And, children are a little bit self-absorbed really through adolescence. We can expect a lot of self-absorption. And so, they may be largely concerned about, okay, now what does this mean for me, right? Like, am I going to be left alone? Could this same thing get me? Actually, all of us throughout adulthood, I think that's a lot of the times when we ask about how a person died or what happened. A lot of times we're trying to reassure ourselves that that's not going to happen to us. And so I don't think that's entirely just a child thing. When children become sort of informed that death is part of life, and especially if the death is somebody who's older, it helps them to really process that death is part of life, and that it typically occurs in people who are much older, and that you're going to live a long life, young child. Mommy and daddy are going to live a long life. We're going to take care of ourselves. We're going to stay out of the street. We're going to take good precautions. And these kinds of things ultimately can be really reassuring for children. So I think sometimes parents and caregivers miss an opportunity to help their child process information and ultimately be reassured by the information, because the adult is uncomfortable and doesn't want to talk about it. And they're not sure that they'll have the right words. But just like everything else that we have to explain to our children in life, usually finding the right words comes, like if you're just being honest with them. Now here's the results of a study that was conducted in 2004. They told the children, okay, so that here's, this little mouse, he lives in the cage, but, he died. It was a bigger setup than that, but I won't bore you with all the details. So the mouse dies. And then they ask him a series of questions now that the mouse is dead. And what you're seeing is the youngest children who are 5, as their average age, are represented in the green bar. The middle-aged children were on average 7 years old, and then the oldest children were on average 10 years old, and they're represented in the blue bars. So will he ever be alive again? A small number of the youngest and the middle children, a small number of them said yes, he would be. None of the 10-year-olds thought that. Is he still thirsty? A couple of 10-year-olds said yes to that. 40% almost of 7-year-olds said he was still thirsty, and almost 80% of 5-year-olds thought he was still thirsty. And then we see that pattern. Does he still feel sick? The 5-year-olds think, yeah. The 5-year-olds think he still wants to go home. The 5-year-olds, almost all of them think that the dead mouse still loves his mother. The 7-year-olds, they were pretty consistent on the amount who thought he was still thirsty, still felt sick, and still wanted to go home. They were pretty consistent across all three of those questions, and they were less than the 5-year-olds. So they're starting to understand that the mouse doesn't still have these same motivations that he had when he was alive. Interestingly, the 10-year-olds didn't think he was thirsty, but they thought maybe 20% of them or 25% of them thought he might still feel sick, and about 20% thought that he still wanted to go home. So clearly a 10-year-old does not have a full grasp of what it means to die. And then this last question, none of the middle 7-year-olds said yes, he still loved his mother, which is kind of a strange gap in this data. But the 10-year-olds, about 80% thought that the dead mouse still loved his mother. So there's a certain amount of belief that the mouse's soul or mind continues on even after physical death. So that's kind of an interesting little detail there, right? That even the 10-year-olds who understand that the mouse doesn't have the typical motivations that a live mouse would have, think that love for his mother will carry on after death. Sometimes I think that we might teach kids to think that by the stories we tell them about your soul will go on and things like that. But even it is a drop down for the 10-year-olds from the 5-year-olds. Right. So it looks like some of them are starting to question that idea that the mouse would have a soul that goes on. Maybe they've been taught that mice don't have souls, right? Like some religions believe that. So maybe they've been taught that, and so they know to say no. It's hard to say. But it's clear that, the youngest kids really don't understand what it means to die, whereas as they get older, they do start to understand that. So adolescents and emerging adults. During this period, you're going to see that invincibility fallacy. Remember, they really don't show a lot of concern about their own death. They don't think that's going to happen to them. That's the kind of thing that happens to other people, right? So that invincibility fallacy is governing this. But terror management theory says that actually we may engage in riskier behaviors as a way to manage our fundamental fear of death. That, you're carrying that fundamental concern that you're mortal around. And so then you may try and sort of, challenge it or defy it by engaging in risky behaviors. Terror management theory also says that we adopt cultural values and moral principles in a way to try to cope with our fear of death, even if it's sort of subconscious fear of death. So the adolescent and the emerging adulthood may say, oh no, I don't think I'm likely to die, or oh, only the good die young, or they say these sort of cavalier things, but the truth is they're doing things that kind of imply that they're trying to buy more time maybe. So if I behave correctly, I may stay healthy or safe or whatever, and I'll live longer. Adolescents in particular oftentimes think that they'll die at an early age. If you ask an adolescent, how old do you think you'll be when you die? A startling number of them will say, 30 or 40. Of course, to them that sounds old. So maybe it's, in keeping, and they're like, well, I'll be really old and uncool and things like that anyway, so I'll probably die. But there's also just sort of this belief that, long life is not for everyone. And so they think they're going to die early anyway. Of course, we see among teenagers and young adults the highest rates of suicides, homicides, and car accidents. So we do see them engaging in these risky behaviors that the invincibility fallacy tells them will be fine for them. Or with the suicides, especially, we see people who are saying, well, I was going to die early anyway. I was probably going to inherit the cancer anyway, or whatever. And so they oftentimes think it's hopeless and, might as well just end it early. And so these strategies that we see with adolescents and emerging adults are kind of evidence that they are kind of in denial about death. They're trying to manage their terror about death by gaining control of it, taking it into their own hands, maybe, things like that. So if we look at what killed 15 to 24-year-olds on average in 1907, we see that the vast majority of deaths in this age group were from diseases, 85%. Nowadays, we have a lot of vaccines and treatments for the diseases that used to kill people between 15 and 24-year-olds, really frequently. Then there were a lot of accidents. Back in 1907, there were a lot of farm accidents. There were, our motor vehicles were a little crazy, driving around the roads. They were mixed in with horses and buggies. There were just like all sorts of opportunities to have an accident and die back then. And then there were really low rates of suicide and homicide back then. But if you compare that to 2007, we're seeing like this, same basic rate of death during this age group, but from different causes. Like diseases are now, barely more than a quarter of deaths during this time. Accidents, way more likely. And then we've had this increase in suicides and homicides. The homicides I'm going to put into the same category as the invincibility fallacy, because a lot of times people are engaging in really risky behaviors that they think are not going to really have the bad result. Suicide, on the other hand, that's much more complex and much more reflective of psychological health and other kinds of things. But with the homicide, I think it's a lot of evidence. Homicide and accidents, a lot of evidence of the invincibility fallacy going on there. All right, so just to kind of take us through the final stage here, just regular adulthood. We start to see across this period of life more and more acceptance of the fact that the person is mortal. They may have had brushes with their own mortality where they really got injured or they had an illness or something, and they recognize, oh my gosh, I really am mortal. And that oftentimes will contribute to taking less risk. Most people who are in this age bracket are trying to, avoid or postpone death, right? Like they're trying to keep themselves healthy. They're trying to keep themselves safe during this period of time. Death anxiety seems to peak in the mid-20s, really with the end of emerging adulthood. And for the rest of adulthood, there's this slow decrease across the lifespan of death anxiety. So as people get older and closer to old age, they're starting to accept death as part of life. And are less fearful about it and things like that. So, all right, let's go ahead and stop there, and we'll transition into terminal illnesses and how people cope with that. So I'll see you in the next segment.